On 17 February 1979, commanded by Deng Xiaoping, the PLA or the People's Liberation Army crossed the borders of northern Vietnam from all directions with well-prepared arms, artillery, and tanks. The war lasted from 17 February until 16 March 1979. Until now, it's often hindered by other well-known historical events such as World War II, Cold War, etc. So why? Why would China ever put its army to its fellow communist brother? Alright, so to understand the cause of the war, we will have to take a look at these three historical events: the Sino-Soviet split, the Vietnamese-Cambodian War, and Deng Xiaoping's goals in Vietnam. Alright, now we have to take a look at the two most powerful and influential communist states back then, the Soviet Union and China. By the end of 1949, as triumph was certainly in the hands of Communist China, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan and decided to settle on the island mainly to evade Mao and the PLA. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the creations of the People's Republic of China, becoming one of the strongest militarized countries on earth in the 1950s. The country was heavily influenced by the thoughts of Mao, which are partially different from Stalinism in the Soviet Union. However, China and its officials weren't bothered too much by its fellow communist beliefs and ideology. Moreover, according to online sources, Mao Zedong seems to have positive thoughts and opinions about Stalin. I quote, "The victory of the Chinese People's Revolution is absolutely inseparable from Comrade Stalin's unceasing care, leadership, and support of over 30 years. But things drastically shifted when Stalin passed away. The successor of him was Nikita Khrushchev, who implemented two brand new policies towards the Soviet system: de-Stalinization and international peaceful coexistence with the Western bloc, which China clearly didn't show interest in. And things started to deteriorate on February 25, 1956, when Khrushchev delivered the secret speech announcing the new policy of de-Stalinization. The main reason why China was in favor of the policies was because it would geopolitically isolate China, and Mao obviously hated it, as China back then had a complicated history with the West after the Civil War. So now it's the late 1960s. Originally, China wished the Soviet government to acknowledge the unfair treaties that were imposed on the Qing in the 19th century, in which the Qing dynasty had to give up a huge amount of its northeastern lands, or outer Manchuria, to the Russian Empire. However, the Soviet government decided to ignore the matter, and comes after that was the series of the Sino-Soviet border conflict. If you don't know what Democratic Cambodia or Khmer Rouge is, then it was a former type of Cambodia's government whose ideology really stood somewhere on the Maoism spectrum. This had given China a potential ally in sabotaging Vietnam's activity. China believed that Vietnam's ambition was to form a greater Indochina Union under the Vietnamese regime by expanding westwards and conquering Laos and Cambodia. Exactly during that time, Pol Pot was in charge of the state of Democratic Cambodia, who had a great hatred towards Vietnam. China seized such an opportunity to establish an alliance between the two nations, altogether holding back Vietnam's quote-unquote wild ambitions. In 1975, Democratic Cambodia had conducted several illegal invasions that violated the Vietnamese territory, Initially, they took the islands of Phu Quoc, which was the first incursion of the series fighting back and forth that has soon later escalated to the Vietnamese-Cambodian War. Forget to mention, democratic Cambodia never ever let the Vietnamese people to enjoy their daily life after the Vietnam War, since these guys always brought their armies along the Vietnamese-Cambodian border to diminish local Vietnamese infrastructures and massacre thousands of innocent Vietnamese civilians. Notably, in 1978, the massacre of Ba Chúc, which killed over 3,000 Vietnamese people, was one of the vicious actions that argued for the brutality of the Pol Pot's regime during their time. However, Vietnam only sought for peace talks and negotiations that could end the skirmishes along the two countries' border, as its economy and everything was heavily damaged after the Vietnam War. So going back to the Soviet Union and Vietnam, on November 3, 1978, things were at its climax when Vietnam and the Soviet Union signed a friendship treaty. According to the treaty, Article 6 said that if one's security is being threatened by outsiders, then the other member has the responsibility to halt it by participating alongside with the invader one in order to fulfill the sacred comradeship between the two. For China, this felt like a punch right into the face, because now it was clear that Vietnam isn't its friend. Alright, so as I mentioned earlier about the barbaric activities of the Khmer Rouge on the Vietnamese soil, but I like to say that they didn't just stop there, and they even tortured on their own people. This resulted in around 2 million Cambodians getting their lives taken away by the authorities. They were either forced to toil until their last breath or killed based on their ethnicity or intelligence. After enduring a long period of time, on December 12, 1978, the Vietnamese-Cambodian War ignited. Now, personally, it's quite controversial here, since the conflict's name is being addressed differently from other countries. As I'm a Vietnamese, we would refer to this war as counter-offensive on the southwestern border, or the War of Securing Southwest Border, whereas the Cambodian nationalists would say that this was a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. So anyway, this event had become a core reason that China clinged on to launch an invasion on Vietnam. This guy is a prominent character that directly sparked the conflict with Vietnam, Deng Xiaoping. So let's see who this guy is. Deng gradually rose to power and had a reputation as the architecture of modern China. Yes, he's undeniably the greatest economist of the CCP, who pulled China out of the slum and made it become a superpower both economically and politically. Deng Xiaoping was a revolutionary and statesman, as well as the paramount leader of the People's Republic, which means the one who holds the highest position in the CCP informally. Deng's well-known reformation was the Chinese economic reform. The idea was that China opened up its economy to the West, but built with Chinese socialism characteristics inside the neo-market system. But he was also the guy that couldn't let Vietnam on its own bring the army to beat up his Southeast Asia ally, Cambodia. And most of the time, Deng's beliefs revolve around that if China wasn't going to take actions on Vietnam, then sooner or later Vietnam and the Soviet Union would destroy China completely. This has seriously increased China's apprehension towards Vietnam. Moreover, bad news were flowing back to Beijing, as the Khmer Rouge has shown extremely poor performances in all of the battles by losing its capital within 2 weeks of fighting. Although approximately 90% of foreign aid weapons were sponsored by China. China needed to do something with Vietnam, and to execute the plan smoothly, on January 29, 1979, Deng Xiaoping visited Jimmy Carter and proposed a deal with him. Deng sought an endorsement from the United States to deter Soviets' intervention in the upcoming war with Vietnam. Deng informed Carter that China couldn't accept Vietnam's wild ambitions, and Vietnam needed to be taught a lesson. During his visit, he once told the president that the child is getting naughty. It's time he got spanked. After US approval, on February 8, 1979, Deng finalized his offensive plans and decided to conduct a limited war in Vietnam. The goals were forcing Vietnam to withdraw its troops from Cambodia and proving that the Soviet Union wasn't responsible for the defense treaty with its comrade. And right, about 2 weeks later, Chinese troops crossed the northern border of Vietnam from all directions, which include these following provinces: Quảng Ninh, Lạc Sơn, Cao Bằng, Hà Tuyên, Hoàng Liên Sơn, and Lai Châu.